This session dealt with another very core, very fundamental piece of modernizing liberalism, and that's the role of the state. You have to figure out what is the proper role of the state, because that at its core is one of the fundamental key pieces of liberalism, is leveraging the state to do these various social goods around kind of liberal ideas or liberal kind of values. And the biggest piece of that role of the state has to really be thinking about the role in the economy.
Why liberalism has failed, particularly to gain dominance for the Democratic Party. Part of it's cultural issues and the inability to speak to what most Americans think. And the other, I don't know whether it's the major part, but certainly a big part of it is the inability to craft a coherent growth doctrine that people would trust, to say we trust liberals to manage our economy and produce prosperity and competitiveness. And now what liberal economics really is fundamentally is a justification for state regulation and state redistribution. So really at the end of the day, liberal economics, for it to, I would argue, have currency again in the political debate, has to get four key questions right, and all four they don't. One, they have to understand and support productivity. Currently, liberals, I think, have a very, very tenuous approach to productivity. They look at it as something anti-worker. The second is innovation. Look at Apple. You know, they're not producing like, oh, Apple's going to thrive by lowering the price of the MacBook and producing 10 million more. No, Apple decided they're going to thrive by producing this amazing device. It's completely different than a MacBook. And in a few years, they'll produce some other amazing device. So it's innovation that is much more central to U.S. prosperity than it was. When you look at what liberals are, they're very, very, again, very, I would argue, almost anti-innovation. Innovation is something seen as a threat, whether it's GMOs or whether it's the internet and privacy. Third is globalization. I think too many liberals view the world as like, if we can just come back to a national economy, we'll be good. Obviously, we can't. And last is corporations. You simply cannot have a vibrant U.S. economy unless you have a vibrant corporate sector.
If you go back to the New Deal era, a consensus of which included modern Republicans like Richard Nixon and Dwight Eisenhower, the basic organizing idea, it was not Keynesian countercyclical, that's greatly exaggerated. It was the mixed economy. The government is now 20%. Since then, it's grown at all levels to about 35%. You have a purely competitive small producer sector. However, there are two other large modern sectors which do not fit the competitive market model. One is regulated utilities. This was before the deregulation of the airlines and of transportation and telecommunications. The other was what Galbraith called the planned sector, a sort of confusing way of thinking about it. It's the oligopolistic, imperfectly competitive big business sector. What is called neoliberalism by the radical left, that's just capitalism. You know, that's an incorrect use of the term. Neoliberalism is the consensus shared by centrist Democrats with moderate Republicans, beginning with Carter and Clinton and Obama among the Democrats. And the basic idea is that the norm for economic organization is the deregulated market. However, this leads to market failures and to externalities. And so therefore, government is legitimate if it corrects these market failures and these externalities. However, when it corrects these, it should do so by either market conforming or what I would think of as pseudo-market mechanisms. So that the last resort is to actually have a public provision of a good or service.
So during the glory days of liberalism, there was always a strong role for the state. Yet what happens when, like in recent years, people's confidence in government, their faith in government erodes?
There has been a fundamental crisis of the legitimacy of the state. So in the piece that I wrote for the first issue of the Breakthrough Journal, I picked up on Daniel Bell, who presciently back in the 1970s predicted that taxation was going to be the central issue of American politics for the next 30 or 40 years. And his reason for saying that was that he thought that the kind of logic of the consumer culture and the individualism was going to create a mentality in which people wanted their entitlements but resisted paying for them because they could use the money for another iPad. Every political faction has their particular risks that they're hitting. other people over the head. And obviously, the anti-tax movement is driven by the risk that the state will come and send us down the road to serfdom. And that's why we must not give them those dollars, or else we'll be headed in that direction. We have to be thinking about a way to persuade the public that they are connected to the state in ways that are deeply legitimate. And it's that point of connection which has been ruptured and essentially needs to be healed in order for us to address any of the range of issues that we need to address. Thanks.
We're now up against the Hayekian cognitive limits of what government can do. Right. Now, some of these can be solved. I mean, think hard about them, absolutely. But I think that's why I tend to think Hayek was right on the substance, that we're now up against the cognitive limits that were not in place when we were just trying to build highways and water projects.
So what is the proper role of the state going forward? What should a reinvigorated liberalism propose that government should now do? For many, the answer had to do with spurring more new technologies and innovation.
I would suggest that the next liberalism, and the next conservatism for that matter, needs to put at the center of its thinking the technological innovation that drives the shift from one economy to the next, instead of treating it as something external that appears.
You can get money for 3 to 5 years, 5 years on the outside from venture capitalists, and I know this because I have a startup company with my son. Then on the longer term, from the government, basic energy science, let's say from the Department of Energy, they're willing to support things that are far away, 20 years out. Controlled thermonuclear fusion is getting $20 billion worldwide. But everything that we have to do, and this is vital from an existential point of view technologically, to address climate change and to address the revolutionary change in the energy system from fossil fuel to non-fossil fuel, is in the 3 to 20 year time frame. And we don't have a way of dealing with that. I mean, we have a name for it. It's called the Valley of Death, because that's the place that it's the hardest to get capital. You can't attract government investment in it because it's too near term, and you can't address venture capital and even corporate investment because they can't justify it to their stockholders investing in, let's say, a new and transformed energy infrastructure.
If you look at where the high-tech industry in Israel has developed from, it's almost one-to-one. Enormous investments in the army, getting the best and the brightest kids going into those units of the army. They leave the army and they create startups. You know, it's been documented, you see it. The incredible miracle of high tech in Israel is completely connected to massive government investment in those kinds of things. And so Israel's relationship to the global economy, in spite of the fact that it's in a context where the American model of a neoliberal model is, in theory, the one that's being used, in fact, it's a strong government intervention that has allowed those things to take place.
We will continue the conversation. We had all kinds of different insights that I think really opened up this issue, laid out a lot of the pieces. And although the answers didn't really come together, we didn't get the final solution or one giant consensus, we certainly thoroughly fleshed out a really fundamental piece in understanding how you'd reinvent liberalism for the 21st century.